Well, hello everybody. My name is Rachel Mullen. When I first started my career, I don't think I could have envisaged standing in front of you today talking about what we're going to talk to you about, because I actually started my career in law and then found myself shifting into threat intelligence, stopped being a lawyer, applied my skills in an entirely different way, and yet here I am back connecting threat intelligence back into sort of that legal area and like regulatory reform or approaches and policy. So coming full circle, and it's lovely to be back here again at the SAN CTI Summit.
Hi everyone, I'm Sierra Stanchak, and I also have a bit of a full circle moment. So this year will be my 10th year anniversary since getting my first SAN cert in 301. So it's really an honor to be on stage 10 years later talking about cyber threat intelligence, and I am ashamed to say I did not keep up with that cert, so it has lapsed. So this is just a friendly reminder to stay up on your certs and your CPEs. But yeah, we're super happy to talk today about applying threat intelligence practically to meet the needs of an evolving regulatory environment.
And just to give a bit of perspective about where Sierra and I are coming from, we are part of a globally dispersed threat intelligence team. So I'm actually based in the UK, Sierra's here based in the US, but we have a range of other members of our team that are based all around the world, really connected into a lot of our wider advisory teams. And we work at an organization that focuses on risk, consulting, assurance, and audit. So we have a lot of opportunities to really apply a client perspective focus and really look at threat intelligence from a sort of business angle. So we're taking all that research analysis, or great research analysis to do on sophisticated threats and finding a way to make that palatable and understandable for people that speak sometimes quite a different language to what we might speak in this particular field.
Hi to GTI if you're watching from abroad. We miss you, and we'll see you soon. So what are we going to cover today? If you read the talk title and you kind of groaned or yawned or thought it might be a little dry, we get it. We're not impressed, you're not impressed, Bob's not impressed, like regulations, all of that, it's a very dry topic, but we're here to impart some wisdom and insights from our team working in this space for quite a while. And so we're going to talk about a few different things today, and hopefully what you can take away for your threat intelligence capabilities or even your own personal intelligence career. While these regulations and frameworks that we touch on today might not directly apply to you now, it's very important to track them, to watch this space, because it might affect your organization in the future. It might affect future organizations that you work through. And to be honest, I don't know if we had it on our bingo card really, but apparently the threat actors are tracking this space as well and filing SEC complaints on their victims. So again, it's just a really interesting time to be in threat intelligence. But as was stated earlier, this is about the 11th or 12th year of this conference. And so I'm going to stick with 11 because that's what I memorized. But 11 years, a lot has changed, and there's up for debate about what hasn't changed. But I think we can all agree that there's now more policies, standards, frameworks, regulations, all of this stuff that we need to navigate on top of our normal day jobs in threat intelligence. And so what we'd like to do is pull out these themes that we're seeing across some of these frameworks and, like I said, provide these insights to you. For sake of brevity and legal counsel, when we say regulators, we might be talking about Warren G, Nate Dogg, compliance, advisors, board level, C-suite. We're going to refer to these people as people who care. So if you want to do that every time I say that, I welcome it. It's a little bit of exercise, but that's how we're going to refer to this from here on out.
And when we think about threat intelligence, and certainly cyber threat intelligence, it's a field that's it's still relatively young. If we look back to sort of when it first started emerging, it was really open space, and a lot of things sort of came out sort of naturally or built out very quickly. And there wasn't really one standard way about what good threat intelligence looked like. Where we stand now, we're got a galaxy of different standards, approaches, frameworks that we need to operate in, and cyber threat intelligence really underpins a lot of a lot of different activities, and so it can't be considered entirely on its own. When we really look at some of the things that it comes under in some of those, where I guess when people who care are thinking about things, they're really looking at sort of threat intelligence maybe as a core concept that's called out, but sometimes you have to read through some of the other concepts where it's actually an underpin or it's something that's connected in that you can't do it without it. So you need to consider it in the broad and as a whole. And the reality is we still don't have one standard what good threat intelligence looks like. So there's a lot of different approaches that can be taken, a lot of different ways that people do consider it. And there are some sectors and organizations that are potentially more mature and have been navigating this space for quite a while, so they might be a little bit ahead of the game. And there are others that are currently looking potentially through the telescope and seeing what's coming forward, and potentially might be just a little bit daunted about what they're looking at and not quite clear on what they might need to do. Because if you look through some of the things that are out there, they're not necessarily prescriptive or telling you exactly the answer. So through working with some of our clients and actually evolving our own threat intelligence practice, we've sort of looked across at a lot of what we're seeing, and we do find that there are commonalities. So we find that there are things that we can take and apply that can help us guide the way as we go forward. As I mentioned, the reality is quite different from maybe it was 11 years ago when we first started when this conference first started. There's definitely a lot more regulations. There's a lot more people who care getting connected into different organizations. And so the sectors that are feeling potentially the pain of having to work through maybe compliance or enforcement type areas has definitely broadened from what it was a number of years ago. It's also changing and evolving in a lot of different regions, a lot of different countries, and you see slightly different approaches being taken. But at the same time, you also start to see some of the fragmentation start to come together, maybe some alignment happening in different spaces, recognizing that there is such a complex environment out there. And for a lot of the frameworks that are around, some of them will tell you the answer or might have like a checkbox answer, but that's not what we're going to give you here today, because we don't have the time to talk through every single regulatory approach that might be out there, every single framework and standard. And you can hear that I'm using these words in like a lot of different ways because there's no one word that explains this entire landscape. But we will give you a bit of a flavor of some of the frameworks that maybe have influenced how we're seeing some of the themes that we're finding that you need to bring into play, just to give you a bit of a flavor of what might be out there. Maybe you are already aware of them because you're already having to deal with them, or maybe they might be new to you today. So don't feel like you're off the hook just because you feel like you're not affected by regulation or regulatory approaches right now. It might be it's coming, so pay attention to what's happening in this space. For Europe, we have the Digital Operations and Operation Resilience Act, also known as DORA. It's not Dora the Explorer, if that's the first thing that came to your mind, which I think it certainly does for a lot of people, but it is one that's affecting the financial services sector in Europe. And this one is really an interesting one because it shows a lot of the fragmentation trying to be pulled together, because there's a lot of different areas where financial services sectors already had to sort of show that they were doing the right things in terms of cybersecurity or threat intelligence or incident response. And this is trying to bring it all together, but it's also taking a slightly different tack. So it's broader than cybersecurity because it's looking at a much more broader business lens, such as a term that you might start to hear permeating a lot of the conversations today, particularly around operational resilience. And that's obviously in the title, so it's calling out what it's trying to do. And some of them might also be a little bit groundbreaking for people because it's looking beyond your own specific ecosystem and forcing potentially organizations to consider it in much more of the broad. It's sort of predicated on a lot more working together, but also focused on really bringing together some of the areas where maybe you have a much more expanded ecosystem because of your supply chain. So what is your risk governance in that way, and how can you engage with some of those organizations? And some of your supply chain might be impacted by regulations because they're under this framework. So it's worth considering. Another one is the NIST, or Network and Information Security Directive, which is also in Europe. This one's an interesting one because it shows that they don't stay static. So it came out in 2018, and now it's implementing sort of 2.0 version. And this one has potentially stronger enforcement, but it also applies to a much broader range of sectors. So people that might not have originally had a focus on really governance around their cybersecurity might be needing to think about it now, and as part of that, needing to really consider threat intelligence. So that's sort of the the galaxy of where we stand today, at least in Europe. But I'm going to pass to Sierra, who's going to tell you about some of the US stuff.
Yeah, and we'll start with Australia. So Australia has the security of critical infrastructure, so SOCI or SOCI, not really sure. But this act came about in the 2018 time period, and in recent years, it has gone through several updates. So a key point here, and as Rachel said, watch this space because it's evolving and you might not be beholden to a certain set of standards now, but maybe a future employer or your own employer might be going through that journey at some point. But also these standards are not static, they do change and evolve. So in the case of security of critical infrastructure, that originally started with 4 sectors, and then in recent years that has, I think, added up to about 11 now. And so part of what companies are dealing with is a little bit of catch up. So, okay, now that we have to comply with this, how do we assess our operations now and then figure out how to map what we need to do, what are the requirements. And sometimes the question is as basic as, I need to know if this even applies to me because I'm in this like weird situation maybe between 2 sectors or a vertical, or I might be a supplier to a specific critical infrastructure company or organization that is beholden to this, so now I have to care about it. So it's just a lot of influx and trying to play catch up and trying to understand and really get an idea of what actually applies, how is threat intelligence defined, and that'll be kind of a recurring theme in our talk. And on the US side, so I think I already had mentioned the SEC requirement. So both security of critical infrastructure and the security or SEC filing requirements, they both kind of involve this concept of incident notification. And so that's a common theme in a lot of these frameworks that we'll touch on. But again, we need to watch the space because now we know the threat actors are also watching this space, and that could, I don't think we could have predicted that. I'm sure someone did in some really great forecasting and analysis, so kudos to whoever has done that. But now we have to figure out how to operationalize that and respond to those types of issues. And so what's really great about the themes that we're going to pull out and this conference is that there are so many talks that are going to dive in a little bit deeper to some of these concepts or frameworks. So even if you're in person and you're attending the Building Your GTI program workshop later today, I believe that is linked heavily to NIST CSF and possibly the 2.0 version coming out. So you'll hopefully be able to find these themes helpful and then explore them more throughout the day. And we'll kind of call out some presentations where we see that happening. So in terms of the threat landscape, again, there's a lot that has changed, a lot that hasn't. But basically, what we all are concerned about is when the threats are changing and there's an incident that happens and it brings it into our organization is challenged by this like push-pull balancing act of competing priorities. And these regulations and frameworks are really looking at those and trying to figure out how we're making decisions, why we're making certain decisions, and especially what are we sharing out and learning from these incidents. But the threat landscape itself, again, like the regulatory landscape, is not static. It does evolve. And so when we're talking about more vulnerabilities being exploited at faster rates, the lowering barrier to entry for threat actors to come into the space and cause harm and impact, these are all huge issues that we're tracking. And like our previous keynote, geopolitics and other technological issues are significantly coming into play more. And I'm sure you've heard a ton about artificial intelligence and threat actors and what does that mean? How can it help defenders? In this space, I'm really excited that the summit is going to address some of those issues as well. So again, the threat landscape's changing, the regulatory landscape is changing, and so how can we really learn from all of that?
When we really look underneath all of the flash, maybe the tools, the sources, the applications that you can use as part of threat intelligence, and potentially also maybe the fear, uncertainty, and doubt that gets sort of pushed out in some of the messages that does get conveyed, If you're really building a sort of a foundation that's solid in the basics, you're a long way towards having a really strong ability to manage and handle your risks and your vulnerabilities. And you might be the person in your organization that's doing threat intelligence, or it might be that you're working with others that are also doing it within your organization. You need to find a way that that's going to achieve harmony effectively. But it is a reality, and it's something that we do need to be considerate of. And it might not be that threat intelligence is entirely on its own, but it's really a part of a whole, and trying to really put that into perspective. And if we look across all the different frameworks and approaches that it might be being taken, there's quite a lot of commonalities that we think that you can draw out to help you build up or mature a capability that maybe already exists. So really reconsider in the scope of what we're seeing and how the world is changing. Are you still doing the right things for your circumstances and what you actually really need to do? So what do you have in terms of threat intelligence? How can you apply it effectively? And what might you need to sort of push the dial further and always continue improving and iterating on what you're doing? So we've got sort of 5 core themes, and we're going to drill into each of those a little bit further today, just to give you a bit of the, if you're listening through it, some of the practical applications that if you're starting to do some of those things, they tend to be the kind of things that help you mature and progress. So we'll delve into accountability as the first one.
Yeah, and if you looked at these attributes and thought, like, this is what I would really actually like to see in a partner or a child, like, we totally get it, but also applies to threat intelligence as well. So starting with accountability. So at the end of the day, people who care want to know if you have an established, dedicated focus or function on threat intelligence. They might not say it like that, but the implied meaning and some of the questions they're asking is heavy in threat intelligence. So do you have a dedicated function? Are you taking it seriously? Sometimes addressing accountability straight on is saying, this is how we define threat intelligence, this is how we handle it in our organization, and this is how we take a risk-based approach throughout this. And having a risk-based approach when it comes to threat intelligence and how it sits in your organization and affects your organization is so key, because that's basically going to say, this is what reasonable steps we are taking to address threats and risk for our organization based on our unique threat landscape. And so part of having your threat intelligence function or capability, whatever that might look like, it might look like a collateral duty for a few people in security operations. It might look like a whole outfit within an enterprise intelligence program, depending on the size of your organization and what your organization actually does. But sometimes even having something as simple as a charter or some kind of document that points to what threat intelligence is defined as for your organization, what it means, who are the key leaders and stakeholders, who are the key contacts, and at the end of the day, what are they charged with doing within your organization, and not letting that file just be established once and sit on a bookshelf and never be consulted again. This should be your banner in your organization when you're talking to key decision makers and you're talking to key partners about what they can expect, and do you need to reaffirm or update your charter based on what you're hearing from them. And same thing with requirements. People who care want to know how you're prioritizing your cyber defenses and strategy based on the threats that you're facing or could face. And so, we're probably going to hear a ton in this conference about, what kind of threats are emanating, how diverse they are, where they're coming from, their motivations, their TTPs. And at the end of the day, as an organization, you have to have some kind of prioritization and requirements to narrow what your focus is going to be if everything happens all at once, let's say the same day. Where are you going to invest your resources and which processes are going to kick off? So that's, what people who care about. Again, the board focus for accountability is so key, because they could be within this group who cares a lot about how you're treating cyber threats. But I think we can agree that cyber threats are making the boards, meeting the radar on our boards more and more, and they're asking those questions. And being able to point to a single source of truth for your organization for threat intelligence is so important, especially as information is traveling around the news media and everything. It's just a little much. So we will move on to maturity. So in terms of maturity, this can mean a lot of different things in threat intelligence. The most important thing is that threat intelligence will not look the same for every organization. It's going to have to be tailored to meet the needs of the organization for it to be sustainable and for it to evolve over time as the organization evolves. And so making sure that you're focusing your efforts to build your threat intelligence capability for the need of your organization, and people who care want to see what's happening, how are you gauging progress, and then how are you moving the needle from reactive to proactive through your threat intelligence capability. A lot of that has to do with lessons learned and assessments. How are you trying to move the needle from reactive to proactive and anticipate what might happen? Do you have practice responses? What do your processes look like? And where they could have been improved or the situation changed, the threat changed, where can you build lessons learned to enhance your processes?
In terms of responsibility, ultimately organizations are responsible for preparing for and responding to an incident or handling an incident if it does occur. And that might play into informing people that might be impacted. It might be informing others that might have a need to know. But it really comes down to being able to be prepared for that situation. And the people who care are looking for how you are taking lessons learned from things that do happen and working out where you need to go to next, and to iterate and sort of improve and build on that one. And sort of playbooks and tester responses are really good ways to sort of refine those muscles and iterate on changes in your personnel, your priorities, or your environment, so that you can sort of see what is the realistic approach as you continue to go forward and to build out sort of proactive threat hunting and threat management. A secondary part of this is around sort of the attribution space. So if you're dealing with supporting threat incident response processes, threat intelligence is often a key part of that whole process. And we often find that people come out asking questions like, who's behind this? Why do they do it? What did they take and what for? And all of this comes back to attribution, which I know in our field can be a very controversial topic. Some people love it, some people hate it, some people don't want it to ever come back into sort of what you need to do. But the reality of what we're seeing in some of the frameworks and what people who care are sort of looking at and asking for requires some level of attribution or getting comfortable with the idea of being able to explain and understand how something that might be impacting you, are they impacting a much broader community, and what can you do to sort of work together to sort of potentially counter the adversary. In terms of threat intelligence, without it, you can't have responsible and accurate attribution assessments. So you really need to bring it into play and start considering it now and how you might then trust what you're using and how you're applying it.
So moving on to community. Community also means a lot of different things within threat intelligence, and I was really happy to see on the summit agenda there are a ton of talks about building CTI programs, building teams and letting them cook. I love the slow cooker analogy, that's awesome. But also looking at how to build your community, whether that looks like your personal CTI network or how to really leverage and maximize external partnerships, such as through ISACs. And so this is a big part of what people who care are looking at, because they're looking at how you're sharing your information, whether it's through incident notification procedures. They're looking at how you're collecting to begin with, and what does the mix of collection look like between internal sources, external sources. Where is the information going? How are you assessing it? What kind of connections are you making? They're starting to ask these questions where I think 11 years ago, we probably would have been like, why do you care? Like, we're doing our thing, we're threat intelligence. But now it's becoming a key question. Where are you getting your information? How are you sharing out information? And what does your incident reporting process look like? So that's been a huge part of community, and I think that's where we can really lean into, especially as practitioners. So we're better together when we're sharing and offering grace to sometimes notifications or reporting that we wish would have said more, but that organization couldn't do it, and that's the reality of it. But really leaning into supporting each other, sharing where we can, and basically doing what we can to put the adversary back on the bench. When we're sharing information, it might result in an adversary having to take time to reconstitute capabilities or reestablish infrastructure, or answer to the people who care on their side why something got burned, why something was no longer working, or why a big investment is now being touted in the media. So again, people who care on their side as well. But the more that we put adversaries on the bench means more time that we can build up our defenses in anticipation for any kind of changes. And really, more time on the bench for them means less operational time for them in conducting attacks and victimization. So leaning into this community concept, sharing, incident reporting, making the most of it, and really supporting each other.
The final sort of common theme, I'm going to flow on from what Sierra's been talking about community, because working together better also applies equally to when you're working with your internal organization. It might be risk management, it might be security operations, it might be business continuity or incident response, or entirely other part of your business that you really need to be integrated and connected into, because you're not really wanting to do threat intelligence in an organization for your own particular needs and desires. It needs to fit with what the organization is really looking for and what's required. It ties a little bit into that intelligence cycle in terms of sort of priorities and requirements, and then getting feedback on that and being able to iterate across that. And having really strong cross-functional workflows amongst your teams really drives a lot of strong sort of threat hunting processes, threat management, and pushes you into the direction of more sort of being on that proactive side rather than the reactive side. So it gives you a chance to sort of build out, bring in a realistic perspective and give a little level of comfort around, are we actually doing the right things? Are we building out scenarios based on requirements, based on what's really happening, and then using that to test what we're doing and really apply that across what we then need to do and build on and iterate across. The sort of the final part of that around is staying together is just the internal concept of the organization. If you aren't really connected in, you might be looking for not being able to distill through the noise and really find the answers you need to pass to your colleagues at the time they need it. You might be even operating and doing things that you really don't need to do because actually, in the scheme of things, it's not going to really help or support your organization. It might be interesting, but it's not applicable. So it's about working together to understand how you're pushing forward and really driving yourself in the direction of what your organization ultimately needs. And if you get this part right, it can make a lot of the rest of it a lot easier. And as we move into sort of the wrap up, we wanted to sort of give you a few questions you might be able to take away yourself and get a bit of perspective for how you might be potentially impacted by regulation or by the questions that people who care might be asking. So it's first off, go work out, what does this mean for you? And if it doesn't mean something for you right now, does it mean something for you in the future? And don't underestimate the level of effort that might be required to push the things in the direction that people who care are asking you questions about. The secondary part of that is how are you using threat intelligence to really, in a really effective way, applying it to the risk lens for your business and getting your business comfortable with what their risks potentially are, how threat can apply into that, and what you might need to do to sort of shorten the divide between those two things. And then the final question is really about, if you didn't lay this groundwork, what would be the impact? Consider that in the whole, and it's a really key part of that question. If you don't think about it now, it might be that you start thinking about it a little bit too late.
And so some of the takeaways up on the screen, and I'll kind of reiterate from the past 11 years, we've done a lot of growing in threat intelligence. And so in another 11 years, where are we going to be? How much are we still going to be talking about these basics? Or how much is the conversation going to shift to building on top of that foundation where we can get more effective about all of these items and get the adversaries on the bench more and getting our collective cyber defenses more in a posture as things change, geopolitics, technology, all of the cyber threats, all of the things happening. How can we define what we're going to do over the next 11 years to really mature our own capabilities? And again, really emphasizing this risk-based approach so that, to Rachel's point earlier, you're doing the right things for the right reasons that have impact, but you're also articulating which steps are reasonable for your organization to take so that when you are communicating with people who care, they know or they have some kind of understanding about the logic around your decisions and priorities when you're addressing these issues. And then most importantly, again, threat intelligence means different things to different people. It means different things to different organizations. So what does it mean for your organization? How can you right-size it so that it can meet the needs now, but that it can be scalable and flexible as the threat landscape grows and evolves, and as the regulatory landscape grows and evolves? And hopefully you'll be able to see some of these themes in other talks. I was also excited to see a talk about communicating threat intelligence to key decision makers to try to get them to care. So there's so many wonderful themes being threaded throughout this summit, and we really thank you for your time. We hope you have a great week, and we're very excited to continue this conversation further.
Awesome, we're gonna continue that conversation right now. So you guys handled that incredibly well. I don't know if you saw people start to frantically scurry in the background, but we lost our internet for about 5 minutes in the middle of your talk. So for folks online who experienced that outage, the recordings were done locally, so you should be able to see their full presentation when that gets posted to the portal. But you all did fantastic, and we've got some great questions. We've got some online, and if you have any in the audience here, raise your hand. We've got some wonderful volunteers in the back who are going to help us with that. All right, so first question. What are your thoughts on actors utilizing legal procedures to identify information that maybe they'll use in future operations?
Do you want to take it or do you want to?
Go for it.
So, I mean, that's going to be part of your calculus when you're choosing to disclose information. And so that's why when I mentioned earlier, we might get frustrated if we feel like an organization didn't share enough, but this is one of the key questions that adversaries are always watching. And how much can they learn, not just about the victim organization, but other organizations that could be similarly affected, striking the right balance between sharing information and doing reporting, and then trying to do a little bit of operational security around that information. And again, that's why community matters. That's why we can't always depend on one avenue of reporting for certain details, and so sometimes closed channels that are highly protected where extra precautions are being made to try to keep adversary eyes off of that information is incredibly important. But I mean, that's all part of the risk-based approach. And that also includes how you're actively responding to an incident. What kind of information are you sharing and the mechanisms that you're sharing, even before you get to the reporting phase.
Awesome. Anyone in person? Make sure to raise your hand high so they can see you, but we had a ton from online. All right. So here's a good question. Do you see regulatory fragmentation as rising and falling in parallel with geopolitical tensions, or do you see it kind of independently fluctuating?
I can take this if you want. I don't think it directly correlates. I think there's probably times when you can sort of see the shifts. Maybe there's more regulation happening in different countries, and maybe that is tied into some of the geopolitical shifts. But some of the fragmentation exists within like one region or one country. So it's really, that's not going to be tied into wider geopolitical shifts. It might be tied into what's happening in a local space. So you can't draw direct correlation is probably what I would argue. But it is worth paying attention to what is happening in that geopolitical space, because some of that conversation will drive policy and will drive what the changes are that are what are happening. And if you look at some of what the frameworks and what they're bringing out, and when they're focusing on things like operational resilience, you can see some of that probably has been driven by what we've seen in the news, what's being put out there in terms of the incidents that are happening, and just the level of interest that the public has, that the organizations and the boards have as well. So it really there's a whole range of different factors that are going to trigger or result in changes or shifts that like the regulatory landscape is going to land in.
Awesome, and here's another one from Slack. For CTI shops that have limited resources, maybe one or two people, any advice for teams to meet regulatory needs while making sure BAU, which is business as usual, is not disrupted?
So I think one of the greatest assets the CTI team especially has when it comes to this is that these types of responses and preparation is really a whole of business, whole of organization exercise. So it really shouldn't fall to CTI only to lead the charge in this aspect. It should be heavily CTI informed. But if it's led by CTI alone or not, so CTI isn't supported, then there's going to be a whole slew of other issues and disconnects. So I would just recommend that you read up on some of these, see the impact, and then really start taking the opportunity to connect throughout your organization to start building a whole of organization response to some of these frameworks that might apply to your company.
I'd add on to that as well, just in terms of the concepts we're talking about, the building the solid foundations. If you get some of that right and get that done now, then it does mean that if you do start to have to address sort of regulatory answers, then at least you have the foundation to start with, and it's not necessarily you starting from scratch and you're having to sort of take all your time away from BAU. It's better than finding a balance about what's reasonable and how to approach it.
So BAU is something people actually say frequently? I had to Google it.
I'm former bureau, so BAU means something totally different to me.
Okay, don't tell us
I
what
was
that
a little
means. We're good.
horrified.
Thank you both so much for your time and for sharing all of your information with us.
Thank you.